All right, Al. I think we're beginning, and we are good. All right, welcome all again. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for hanging out whilst we do this. All right. So we're going to start tonight. History in a bowl of tea in the Song period, with a little bit of a slideshow. I don't want to be that person who's like, now it's time for a slideshow. But hopefully the slideshow will help give context. It will also help give a little bit of background into the development of what we're going to be having tonight. And then it will also kind of get into what actually is going on. Why are we doing all this? What's with all the little, tea caddies, if we want to use that term. We'll find a proper term for it later. What is going on here? Not everyday tea equipage that we've seen here. So, what is tea in the Song period? Well, let's first ask the question, where do we want to go with this? Tonight we're going to look at evolution of tea prior to the Song, just basically touching on things like Tang period and pre-Tang period. If you don't know what that is, we'll delve into that. We'll also look at tea during the Song period, sort of the movers and shakers. What would you find if you were actually in that time, and what would you expect in terms of tea and maybe teaware? And then finally, we're going to get into actually making tea, both the processing of tea as well as the actual whisking and drinking of tea and things we want to think about as we're doing all of this. So get ready, put on your time-traveling boots if you want to do that, and we'll jump right in. So first off, I made this presentation last night. This afternoon, maybe 2 hours before this shindig happened, I was grinding tea. We want it fresh, and we'll talk about how that's done. But my buddy said, show me your presentation. And I'm like, I will, thank you very much. And I sent him the presentation. And he's like, Scott, wouldn't it be a great idea if you had a slide that talked about the linear history and time and sort of placing not only what we're going to be talking about today into context, but also talk about maybe like how long ago was it? How far did that stretch? Let's consider, is this modern history we're talking about, or is this way, way back? Well, this timeline, if you can read it, folks at home, if you can read it, this shows basically close to maybe 3,000 years of Chinese history, if you can give or take. And actually, the longest part of this is not even on this timeline. It extends way beyond that. If you can follow my shadow, it goes way over into that alcove where you have the Sòng, and then where you have prehistorical states, where we may have archaeological artifacts, where we may have maybe some tomb remains, but we don't have a written history of, let's say, China, and certainly of tea, much further than this. So, but Sòng is kind of that first, starting point. Where we'll be delving tonight is right here during the Song period. This is 960 to 1279. And I'll say give or take because there's a little bit of a disrupt in the Song. We'll talk a little bit about the splitting of the Song court in 1127 and why that was the case. But we'll also talk about really we're not dealing with the bulk of Chinese history here. We're dealing with just this amount, right, from here to here, 960 to 1279. We're right here, the modern period. So in terms of Chinese history, we're actually pretty close to the Song. It sounds a little crazy. But in between this time and this time today and the Song period is well over 1,000 years. And we'll begin our story, our history, well before that. So jumping right in, this is China roughly in the 600 BC period. I put some dates up here, 4000 BCE to 960 AD, because I also want us to put this into context of what we'll be talking about tonight. So first off, where did tea get its beginnings or origins? It really isn't in China. It really isn't in what we would consider at the time of the Song, China proper. Instead, it's happening over here in this little green splotch. This is where we have modern day Myanmar. This is where we have a little bit of Laos. This is where we have a bit of Yunnan and a little bit of Nepal right here. And up in the mountains, we have Camellia sinensis and Camellia sinensis Assam varieties of tea growing wild. They are evergreen plants, and they're the little shrubs that you might see if you went into somebody's garden. They're camellia. So for those who don't know the camellia. They're a very specialized camellia, and long, long ago, we'll get into this, it was isolated that this had certain healing properties, certain medicinal and sort of stimulating qualities to it. But it starts right around here. It isn't until about the time of the Bashu state, which is beginning, the culture of Bashu goes way, way back, but the Bashu state emerges, as we see it on this map, around the spring and autumn periods, roughly 600 BC. And it's during this time that we have really the early popularization of what we consider tea. It's not really tea as we know it. It might be called chu, it might be called ming, it might be given a number of other names. And really it's just a medicinal herb, one of thousands of different medicinal herbs that you'd find in Chinese medicine at this time. What we do want to pay attention though here are, I'm calling out different tea farms and tea production areas within China and outside of China in some cases. And this is what the tea production during the Tang period, the 600s to 800s roughly, early 900s, would look like and where those would be. So we're seeing most of it happening in the southwest, all right, much of which is in places like Yunnan. We have a little bit in what's modern day Sichuan. So we have Ya'an, which is producing brick teas, which are then being sent down what's called later the Tea Horse Road, or the ancient Tea Horse Road, the Chamak Mudal. And this was a system of trading tea for horses, essentially trading tea for their version of the fastest car, the fastest vehicle that they could have, which they would leverage in military situations mostly. But what we're also finding is the emergence of tea that would then turn into what became very famous during the Tang period, and we'll touch into that. So, as I mentioned, tea started off as a medicine, and we kind of have to thank this individual here, Shen Nong, who's depicted here in a 1503 painting by Guo. He's considered the divine farmer. He ate hundreds of different herbs and mushrooms and lichens and things. And he was poisoned, I think, by 76 of them, and only one was able to aid in the recovery, and that was tea. So tea, very, very early on, beginning in sort of the pre-13th century period, so a long, long time ago. We have what was probably a sort of collective knowledge of what tea did, right? It wasn't just one person. This is just kind of an amalgamation maybe of all of those people, but who knows? Anyways, he's sitting on a tortoise. That's the tortoise's tail. And then what we have here is what tea probably would have looked like during the Tang period. This is a modern day Korean dokcha. This is a compressed tea cake. I have a few floating around here. If you want to take a gander, you can pass them around. They're like little cookies, little biscuits. When we think of the term cha bing, the term bing means biscuit or cake. This is very much a biscuit or cake. Pulverized tea leaves pressed into a mold. A hole is pierced in the center, and then they're hung up to dry. And afterwards, they take that, they grind that, they turn it into a powder, of which they then throw into some boiling water. I'm oversimplifying this. Go read the words of this gentleman. This is Liu Yu from 733 to 803. He is famous for writing what is called a Cha Jing, or the classic of tea, in this 760, 762. He's really the first to talk about tea not only as something beyond medicine, but purely as a beverage for the sake of enjoyable consumption. During this time, tea would have been part of a panoply of different herbs that would be mixed into soups and mixed into medicinal concoctions, oftentimes with things like green onions, salt, roots, flowers. He foregoes all of that, save the salt, and he starts talking about how we prepare tea, how we prepare it in a way that really emphasizes the flavor of tea, and what are sort of the skillful ways that we can coax those flavors out. Again, super oversimplification. Here's a page from the Cha right here. This, I believe, is a Ming reprint. So, and also this picture, historically inaccurate. This was probably painted in the modern period. This is some modern teaware. We'll look at some very old teaware though, such as this. This is a Xingyao white glazed tea bowl. This was favored by Milieu. He preferred having something that was white so that when you looked at the actual tea liqueur, you could appreciate the true color of that tea. During this time, however, a lot of people also liked green wares or sort of an off-brown green ware, and that would emphasize the sort of ruddiness or redness of a tea. So we can kind of get a sense from just looking at what aesthetically they're idealizing in tea, maybe what tea would look and possibly taste like. This is a tea grinder from the Tang period. This was found in a grave in the Famen Temple Royal Burial Chamber in Shanxi province. This is one of, I think, 7, maybe 8 or 10 different pieces of teaware that would belong in a set. The set itself sat into a box in the shape of a turtle. Again, a turtle comes back. And if I were to do a separate presentation on Tang period tea, I would walk you all through specifically the different steps of how you prepare that tea. This would be one of those steps. Essentially, though, this chops the tea leaves once they break that little puck down. And you'll still find things like this in Chinese medicine, traditional medicine practice as a herb grinder. Here we have the another Xingyao piece, and this is what is most likely a tea stove. This was produced in the Tang period, and here you have the stove itself. You would have a little bit of probably a type of charcoal or carbonized wood. You know, it would sit in here and you would fan it. This keeps it away from the detritus of the ground, and then this is where you would have water, and you would place your tea in, place a little bit of salt, and let it come to a light boil, after which a foam would rise, and you would scoop a bit of that foam and a bit of that liquid out of that and serve. And we actually, if you can make it out in here, this is very, very much what you're seeing here, just painted by what is purportedly a painting from the Tang period. It may be a copy from the Sòng of a Tang painting. And here we have a tea master sitting here, and you can't really make it out, but he has 2 tongs that he's using to lay bits of tea into this. And then this probably like a cha hong, a tea servant or tea page, is coming over, and they're going to pour some of that into a cup like this with a little set and sort of dais that it's sitting on. And you can see this is most likely a Yue or a Xingyao ware. Other wares from this time period, we have the emergence of ewers as a thing. This is a shape, at least the center shape, is becoming popular in the Tang, and it has its origins in the Persian and even ancient Roman sort of political and cultural spheres. It comes down through both things like the Silk Road and through trade, mostly overland trade, and makes its way into China. So we see shapes like this making their way, and they're actually trying to reproduce what would probably originally have been articulated in metal, either gold or silver. What we have here is a ewer with a side handle. The side handle is good because it keeps your hands out of the fire, something like that. Let it show. In addition to that, you start seeing things like this and continue to see things like that, both as teaware but also as medicine wares. You'll go even to traditional medicine practitioners, and you'll see pots similar to this. This is a Yuejiao Yao Celadon tea bowl. It's kind of a early Celadon, if we want to use that term. And this is sort of the other color that is very popular during this time period for tea, and it's a sort of brown-green Celadon. Finally, we're in the Song period. Anybody have questions before we jump right in? This is Sòng China right here. You can see it's this kind of golden raw color here. And then we see a number of other cultures and kingdoms around here. We have Dali, which is a kingdom within modern day Yunnan and parts of Laos. We have our Tibetan plain, which is occupied by the Tibetan kingdoms. We have the Tangut, we have the Kirtan, we have the Goryeo, which is the Korean Peninsula. And then we have, at this period, would be both Nara and the courts of Heian-kyo in Japan. So very, very big overview of this, and we'll kind of dip our toe into some of these other cultures. But before we do that, let's look at the different types of tea. So in the dark green and in the red in this corner, we have our ancient teas from both the pre-Tang and Tang states. These are being pressed into cakes. These are being pressed into bricks, and many of them are being sent out of China. Those that are in green are Tang period tea gardens, and they're producing things that are both for export but also beginning to feed an import or forgive me, a domestic market for tea, because people, after the popularization from milieu and people like him, mostly within the scholarly class, but also for other reasons within the popular class, you have the emergence of a tea drinking populace in China. You have within most cities now tea houses, and you have within most sort of scholarly circles discussions about tea. In the Song period, we have the movement of the capital to Kaifeng, which you can't really see because this isn't quite focused, forgive me. But during this time, you have the emergence of a series of very famous tea farms on the east coast of China, many of which are existing in Fujian and near modern-day Zhejiang. Probably the most famous is Beiyuan, which is near modern-day Yishan. So we're beginning to see, as modern tea drinkers, the beginnings of this geography of tea that we'll see really start taking off, both in the Song, but again, for modern loose-leaf tea drinkers, begins to explode in the Ming and the Qing. So we're not there yet, but what we will see during this time period is the emergence of a new style of tea. This is Mengdingshan in Sichuan, and then this is Beiyuan, the Imperial Tea Garden. These produce the famous teas from the Song period, Beiyuan especially, and scholars as well as emperors begin to wax poetic about these teas, and you'll find them in writings. Huizong in the 11th and 12th century begins writing about this, but then you also have writing about this as well from people like Xiong Fan, who's a scholar and starts writing about the production of gongcha, which is tribute tea that is being used as a taxable item, something that is then sent to the imperial court as a form of tax. So a lot of things going on in this particular time. The tea that they're producing during this time period is markedly different than those little rough pucks that I passed around, which have made their way back here. Rather than simply pulverize and pack cakes, they are now steaming the leaves and grinding the leaves and pressing them into molds. These molds are oftentimes embossing the sort of upward surface of the tea. So you have things like these, what are poetically called the Longfan Tuancha, which means dragon phoenix cakes. And the reason why they're called that is pretty obvious. You have your dragon, you have your phoenix, dragon. And it's kind of an early form of branding. This is people saying, you know what cake I'm producing, it's the one that's marked with this particular dragon. They come in different shapes and sizes. This one we have, I believe, is a plum blossom. We have them in ingot shapes. We have them in coin shapes. We have them in all different types of shapes. Early on, they were taking these cakes and they were pressing them and they were imbuing them with a sort of waxy substrate, usually made out of camphor resin. And historians are going to smack me if I'm wrong on this, but the camphor resin actually lent a flavor to the tea cake. So rather than just tasting tea as tea, you'd also have this crazy camphorous flavor happening. So it really, really changed the experience. By the mid to late Song, you begin to see tea connoisseurs saying, we don't need to be flavoring our tea, it's good enough. So it's kind of like if you go and you have, I don't know, we're all tea people, we all know that, like when you flavor tea, it adulterates the flavor and you're not really tasting the tea. For those who are not tea drinkers, it's kind of like having, I'll make a coffee analogy, it's like your non-dairy creamer with the, they make it in flavor of like Cinnabon now. So if you like Cinnabon and you don't like coffee, maybe that's a good way to drink a coffee. I'll not say that anymore. I work in the coffee industry too. So how is tea being produced? So what we talked about in the Tang period, in terms of plucking, withering, and packing the tea, changes slightly. What we have, and isn't really on this, is that they begin to pluck the tea leaves at a very specific time of day, usually early morning, usually when it's a little cool, usually in early spring. When they're plucking the leaves, they're making sure that they're getting the uppermost buds of those leaves, and there's a whole classification process around this that didn't exist in the Tang. What we're looking for as we're plucking this is a very bright colored green leaf, though at times in the early Song they were also looking for purple leaves. They might even be looking for kind of a yellowish leaf. But by the late Song period, when this process is really drilled into, they're looking for a very specific type of tea bud, one that is akin in shape to a sparrow's tongue, if you know your tea shapes. After which they pick it, they wash it, they steam it, and then they begin to grind it down, and then they pack it into a little cake, like kind of what we saw in the earlier slides, and then they dry them. And once they're dry, they pack them away, they wrap them in paper, and you can kind of age these teas, you can store them. After which, though, if you wanted to make some tea, you'd take that little cake, you'd wrap it in paper, and then you'd pulverize it. And that's kind of what you're seeing here. This is a little sort of modified mortar and pestle. And you hammer it down, you break the cake, and then you put it into a sieve, you put it into a leaf chopper like we saw during the Tang period, where you might have it in a mortar and pestle where you will grind it down. This is what they did in the early Song period. By the mid to late Song, though, they're beginning to use this tea mill, which is akin to like a grain mill, where you have two sort of stone cylinders sitting on top of each other. There's a channel that leads down, you put the tea down that channel, and then as you're turning, grooves within the stone cylinders, as it's spinning, presses the tea down, grinds it, and then pushes it out to an outer rim where you then can kind of sweep it into a little container. But before you put it into that container, you put it through a sieve, and that makes sure that any little loose bits of hard tea material doesn't make their way into the final product. Once placed into a container, you can then take it to wherever you want, mountaintop, scholar studio, a pavilion perchance. And then you would take that, you'd scoop that out of the container, put it into a bowl, and then pour liquid over the top, hot water. And there's a specific way of pouring, we'll go over that later. But this is what we call marking the tea, or tian cha, and this is one of the first real changes that we see during the Song period, is that they use this process of tian cha, very skillfully placing the water into the tea and then whisking it with a very specialized tea whisk. In the early Song, they use a teaspoon similar to something like this, usually made of gold, silver, iron, and if you were really not able to afford that, maybe out of bamboo. So, and you would use that to whisk the tea. It's not easy. After which you place the tea bowl onto a stand, and we'll go over that too. During the late part of the Song period, we have the publishing of the Chaju Chuzan, which is the pictorial of tea, by Shenan Laoren. This showcases at least 12 different tea wares that a true tea aficionado should have. Each one is named after the official rank that you'd find during the Song period at this time. So they're given kind of poetic names. A whisk might be called the sort of vice advisor bamboo, to give an example. So these are not one-for-one translations. This does not say ewer, this does not say tea grinder. And instead they're giving these poetic and sort of officiated names. But the idea is that you didn't have a complete set unless you had all of these advisors together. So again, if you could afford it, go for it. What we're finding during the Song period too is an emergence of highly specialized and highly diversified forms of teaware. Here we have not only tea bowls, but we have tea stands, we have ewers, we have brush washers, and all of these are basically meant to facilitate the enjoyment of tea or the enjoyment of the sort of life of scholarly pursuits. So what we're finding also is the emergence of kilns to facilitate this, and various different ways of making a different take on different types of tea bowls. We'll kind of look at some of these real quick. This is what a Song period kiln would look like. This is a longyao or dragon kiln. It's built on the slope of a hillside, and then there are different chambers where you place ceramics to be fired, and then you have fire pits in between each, so you have control over the heat, but each chamber could potentially have different heat values, so you could produce different styles of wares. To increase and focus that heat, they developed something called a sagger. This is made out of a sort of throwaway clay, and you would set a bowl into that. It would sit onto a little saucer, so it was actually not touching any of the sagger itself, and heat would concentrate within the sagger, producing very interesting effects with the glaze. In this case, let's say if you moved it ever so slightly, the bowl or the piece of ceramic would become embedded in the sagger and would fix itself, meaning that you could not remove it from the sagger. And you'll find these all throughout China around the old kiln sites because they were basically throwing them away. Different types of ways of making bowls emerged during this time. During the Tang, bowls like this would have been incised or carved. By the Song period, they're using things like hump molds, where you would place a blank bowl on top of the hump mold and then remove it, and that would give you a very nice pattern inside. Once glazed, you'd get this wonderful effect where you'd have, a sort of depth emerging from there. This is a Yaozhou Yao Celadon tea bowl with a motif of boys in prunus, so from the Northern Song. This one I believe has maybe some birds, so kind of hard to tell. Other types, these are Jizhou Yao, different varieties of Jizhou Yao bowls. I have a recreation of one of these sitting right here. And we have our tortoise shell, we have our sort of loose brush strokes, maybe a sort of partridge feather thing going on. And then we have sort of black glaze with paper applique. They would use paper, place it onto the glaze, and then as it goes through the firing, the paper would burn off, leaving a sort of negative imprint on there. They all have poetic names. I mentioned a few, and there are more than just these that you'll find in this time period. You even have things like this. This is where you place, instead of a piece of paper, you'd have a leaf. So as the leaf burns off, it gives a little bit of chemical exchange with the glaze and then produces this beautiful effect. So, other types of glazes, we have our Longchuan, which is a very famous form of sort of greenish blue, greenish white celadon. We have our Junyao, which comes in all different colors. This is a purple splash Junyao. They also have red, they also have green. It's basically whatever iron or copper can produce, it will produce this crazy flaring effect. And then you have famous Qingbai, which is a sort of blue-white color. And here we have tea bowl and tea bowl stand. So where are we finding all of this? It's not just, hey, I'm Crazy Scott with some tea bowls hanging around in the Song period. These are the popular wares of the up and ups in this time period, and we'll kind of situate it within the social strata. So tea was consumed by everybody in China at this time, either as a medicine or as a popular beverage. But are they using tea bowls? Are they even whisking the tea? There's a good chance that they're just drinking it more or less like how we're drinking it today, an infusion of either a ground up tea or an infusion of loose leaf tea. Grinding tea takes a lot of effort, as I found out this afternoon, and it takes a lot of tea. You use about 5 times as much tea to produce 1 bowl of tea as you would maybe 10 to 12 cups or pots of tea if you were loose leaf brewing it. What we have here is a literary gathering where you have scholars hanging out, drinking some tea, maybe drinking some wine as well, and they're being served by folks who are bringing them tea on these little ceramic dynasties. These folks are not lifting a finger. These folks are running the country as scholarly elite, and they are enjoying the sort of affluence of things that were produced during this very rich time period. Where we do locate those tea brewers, however, are, well, down here, way off in the distance actually, or in the foreground. But certainly a very significant divide here. They're placed on the low register of this, whereas you have the scholarly class in the nice middle space, and then you have these wonderful trees representing things like the never-ending, change and mystery of nature. And then you have some dudes hanging out here probably talking about stuff. So you can't see it, there are some ducks hanging out there too. So all of these have meaning, and where they're located on this means something too. And when we look at the folks who are making that tea, well, before we do, here's some of the things that you find on this table. Very nice. Yao ewer in size and repaired with a little bit of gold later on, and then some Qingbai pieces. But going back to the people who are actually making tea, they're forced much lower down the register, and they are even depicted as figuratively smaller. So there's maybe some sort of visual cue or power play being played out here. But nonetheless, what we see here is technology that is modern, located in this bottom register and focused on making tea. We have our ewers, we have our cup stands, we have our different types of sort of braziers. We have this wonderful transparent, probably by way of silk netting, container for teaware that you can bring around. And then you have something that you can bring water to, and then this is probably a big thing of water here too, where they are sifting through a sieve before serving and turning into tea. But all of these work together to make a bowl of tea. So what we have here are probably jianyao from modern day Fujian, tea bowls, like this one right here with the Chuhao design, the hairs for modeling that we have in the interior of the bowls caused by iron and sort of the reduction within the kiln. And we see them depicted here, getting ready to be served. And this person is probably scooping either a very big, large amount of tea, maybe tea powder, or maybe some water, and about to put it into one of these bowls. It's a little hard to tell. Here again, we have that wonderful sort of class divide that we see throughout history, right? And it is very clear that we have people who are making tea on this side, and very clear the people who are enjoying that tea right here. And really just, there's no real interaction. This guy's got his back turned to this guy, and these guys are kind of talking amongst themselves. Anywho, what we do see going on here, though, is this gentleman here is grinding some tea into powder. This is a device this is a brazier. And then this is, if you saw very closely, a spouted kind of rudimentary pot. And then this gentleman here has a ewer in which he's doing some diancha into what looks to be a very, very large tea bowl. If you look even closer, and you can't really make it out here, but what we see here, if you follow the shadowy finger, that is a tea whisk. And it would be a tea whisk very much like this one, which which was depicted in the Chasing Sanzan. So this is the tea ring. What we see here, and forgive me, some of these are a little low or maybe need to be focused, but this is details from 500 Lohan paintings, which are now on in the collection of I believe it's Daitokuji in Japan. It showcases Lohans or Arhats, or people who follow the Buddha, hanging out enjoying tea. And in this case, what we're seeing here are two demons making that tea, and we see a tea breaker, a tea cake breaker in there, and then we see this little grinding device that he's moving back and forth. This one right here. Additionally, too, we see those Lohans yet again enjoying tea and being served upon by these acolytes here, and they're being served yet again in these black jianyao-ware bowls, and in this case, it's most likely a bowl like this, which has the sort of yodi or oil spot patternation that's occurring. Also to note, during this time period, it was very popular to encase the rim of tea bowls, especially ones coming from the jianyao kiln, with either gold or silver or sort of semi-precious metal. The reason being is that when you put one of these into a kiln, oftentimes the glaze will run off the uppermost part of the bowl and leaving it exposed. I'll pass around, this is most likely from the Sòng period, that's what they said. It's a Qingbai bowl, and you can see that rim is left exposed, and this would be pretty common for that time period. If you have rings, I do tell you now to maybe remove them as we're touching the old bowls. I'll hand around another bowl. This one is a Yodi style bowl. This is a Japanese replica of a Tianmu or Tenmoku bowl from the Song period. This is not from the Song period, probably from the 1970s. It's not old, but still. You get the idea with the encasing of the rim. We'll drink out of this bowl later, as well as a variety of other bowls. But what we see here is the use of this lacquered dais that it's sitting on. And then you also see the use of, you can't quite see it here, but he's using a red lacquered whisk. And you see him Diancha, that is marking the tea. So this was done in the late 12th century, so we kind of see, captured in this image, what tea brewing was like at this time period. This is a funerary mural, or a tomb mural that was found in Hebei province. And here we see a variety of different tea servers preparing tea for what would have been the individual who's buried in this tomb. And so you can see here a tea spoon, which would have been a version of a whisk. What we also see here is most likely a whisk itself. And it's a little hard to tell. If you saw up close, you would see this thing that has like little fingers coming out of it. Person probably had seen a whisk, and they're like, okay, I know how to do this. We also see a brazier here, which we see a different version of it right here. This is from the northern Song. This is from the Liao, which is not in the Song dynasty, like in the territory, but is contemporary too. And they too also had tea culture heavily influenced by the Song. Here we have the grinding of tea, and here we have a little tea caddy down here. And these are probably storage devices for either tea cakes or teaware. And the little dais that they sit upon. As tea really makes its way up and through society, we see its adoption within the imperial court. Most famously, we have Emperor Song Huizong, who is the last emperor of the northern Song period. And he considered himself a scholarly gentleman of this time. He pursued the 4 arts of China, and you can see him enjoying at least one of them right here. This is the Wu Qin. And he was known for not only enjoying tea, but also waxing poetic about tea and teaware. His famous Cha Guan Da Lun is a or Dagwan Chalu, is the text of all tea texts from the Song period, where he details not only the production but also the various methods in which tea is made, as well as the way that it's prepared. And he offers quite a bit of detail into how that's prepared. Later on, we'll go kind of step by step, taking sort of riffing on the style that he's discussed. Oh yeah, and this is a Ruyao cup stand. Ruyao is a imperial kiln. By an imperial kiln, I mean something that was producing wares for the imperial court and for the emperor. They were not distributed outside of that, and they are quite rare at this moment because by the end of the Northern Song period, as you have northern kingdoms pushing through and actively destroying the capital and the variety of wares that come from that, we have probably a destruction of Ruyao wares, so they're very rare. We don't see much of them, and when they do go up for sale or auction, they fetch multiple millions for even the smallest of teas. And this is a cup stand. Ruyao is known for having sort of a blue-green color and a very nice sort of light crackling. But where is all of this tea culture coming from? A lot of people would say it's coming from the upper echelons of society. Well, the joke is on them, because the real origin story of tea during the Song really has to do with individuals like this. These are probably tea sellers, maybe tea farmers. They are certainly connoisseurs of their trade, and they produce various different ways of enjoying tea in the early, mid, and late Song, where they would come and gather and enjoy their product. They are the ones who began to adopt the use of very specific types of tea bowls, some of which we have reproduced here in front of us, for the sole use of enjoying color and the quality of the tea foam that arises. They're the ones who begin to popularize what we know as diancha, marking the tea. They're also the ones who begin to popularize what's called doucha, which is the tea competition, to see who can make the best looking foam on their tea. And the idea is that you make a beautiful foam and then you see how long that foam will last. It's kind of silly, but it's also very interesting. And these are the folks who are really formulating and innovating on this, and it's scholars and later emperors who begin to take notice and begin to adopt that and adapt that to entertain themselves. This is a gentleman with a viewer making the tea. So I'll leave you with this, at least in terms of where we are in China. We have within the Chalu, the record of tea written by Sai Xiang, who is a scholar during this time period, also a very famous calligrapher. He begins to wax poetic on this beautiful black Jianyang cup. He says tea is of light color and looks best in black cups. The cups made out of Jianyang are bluish black in color, marked like the fur of the hair. Being of rather thick fabric, they retain the heat so that when once warmed through, they cool very slowly, and they are additionally valued on this account. None of the cups produced at other places can rival these. So he's not only marking what the tea looks like, but he's also saying, and use these beautiful cups. He's an aesthete, and he's putting forth what he believes is a mark of beauty. This style of tea becomes so popular within China that its tribute states and sort of satellite kingdoms within East Asia began to take notice, largely through the movement of Buddhist monks coming to China and learning forms like Chan Buddhism. And from that we have sort of splinter groups forming and creating their own tea culture, one of which is Korea. This is Korea during the Goryeo period, 1918 to 1392. Here we have a beautiful lure that's made of this amazing sort of apple green celadon. Next to that, we have, again, that sort of riff on boys and prunus. In this case, it's boys and lotus. And over here, we have a inlaid design of bonghwang and clouds. And during this time period, the Korean ceramicists actually began to produce styles that began to inform the Sòng court. So it's kind of, yes, we'll learn from you, but then we'll also further innovate and make something that you may have shown us into something that's even more exalted. So objects like this would eventually make their way back into, or would make their way into China through a way of interconnection of the Korean courts and the Chinese courts, and would eventually be enjoyed by the nation of, or the kingdoms within Japan, which also began to make their own tea. Saicho and Kukai is not on here, sorry Kukai, brought tea back to Japan during the Nara period, which is well before the, it's contemporary to the Tang. And they're bringing tea back most likely as what you would see in the Tang, and kind of played well within the sort of Sinophilic court of Japan at that time. You do have a moment where Japan shuts itself off from Chinese influence, and later, during the 11th, 12th, and 13th century, they began to introduce that back. And a lot of that's done through the efforts of Buddhist monks who are going to China and learning about Chan Buddhism, meditation Buddhism. Nyoen Eisai is one of those, and he comes back basically smuggling some tea seeds with him in a little tea caddy, medicine caddy, which we have reproduced on this table and pictured right here. And he plants these seeds in the hills around Fuji, which are still producing tea to this day. And he's making tea most likely, again, in the style of the Sòng. That later turns into what we now know as eventually will turn into what we know as Chanayu, which is roughly translated means tea and hot water, but we know it as the Japanese tea ceremony. So that's the long story, which we won't get into today. So where does this lead us? Well, we came here thirsty. We came here curious. Hopefully our curiosity has been fed, but maybe our thirst has not been quenched. So at this point, we're going to sort of shift tack and start going into how do we actually make this crazy thing called Song Dynasty style tea. I'm going to show you the way that I make it. It's a version, and it excludes some steps, which if I really got crazy, I'd probably eventually do. I'm not there yet. What we start off though with is, in this case, a loose leaf white tea. This is a Fudin Bai Cha, in this case, depicted here. Leaf quality-wise, it seems to be very close to what's being described during the Sòng, where you have these, what they call white tea or Bai Cha, but really was kind of closer to what we probably call a green tea today. We don't really know what it is, but they do talk about sort of a greenish, whitish tea leaf, and that's what we have here. I go through the process of first kind of breaking those down, after which I began to pull out hard bits of tea leaves, darker tea leaves, and tea stems, which you see here. After that, I began to grind and sieve. This process can take an hour to 2 to 3 hours, depending on how much you want to make. I'll tell you this much, what I'm making right now is enough for maybe 3 bowls of tea. So that's about 5 grams, 7 grams of tea, maybe more, depending on the tea leaf. Different tea leaves yield different amounts. I'm grinding, and I'm grinding down to a fine powder, to the point where when you grind, you're actually seeing the hairs of the tea leaf point upwards, and the reason why they're pointing upwards, I believe, has to do with static electricity. You're infusing them with electrons at that point. As you do that, you sift again and you remove those hairs, leaving a very, very fine tea dust. And you're trying to aim for a micron level of about maybe 20. High-grade matcha is about 10 to 0. So we're not even close to that, I hate to say it. After that, now is the point where we're going to be making some tea. We'll go through this step by step today. First off, you want to warm your whisk. This is Scott's crazy version of a Song period whisk. They still make Song period whisks in Japan. They're just not called Song period whisks. They are for a different type of tea. It's for another day. You warm the whisk, you warm the tea bowl, then you dry the whisk and you dry the tea bowl. So neither are very wet at that point. Next, you scoop about 3 to 6 scoops of tea dust or tea powder and place into the center of the tea bowl. And then you add a very, very small amount of water into the tea bowl, making sure not to go directly into the tea, but instead go around the tea. And it really should just be enough to turn it into sort of this thick, kind of dough-like matter. After which, you begin to slowly knead the tea into the point where it becomes a thick paste. And then as you're kneading, you add the first sort of burst of water, which you then begin to whisk into a foam. After which you add yet again another round of water, continuing to whisk. Foam will begin to rise and begin to thicken. You continue this process, adding more water, speeding up the whisking, letting the wrist loosen, allowing for a quicker whisk. You begin to raise the whisk as you're whisking and allowing more water to come in, and you'll begin to see the foam not only grow in profusion, but also become tighter. There's a sort of poetic reference here too. It should look like freshly fallen snow or like icy snow. And then by the 6th time that you add water, you really should be seeing quite a fair amount of that foam, and it should look very smooth and very velvety. By the 7th time, if you need a 7th amount, a whole dash of water, you will then whisk, and then through a circular motion, go around the edge of the bowl, go out and then tap the edge of the bowl and pull up the whisk, allowing the sort of foam to mound in the center. By this point, you have hopefully prepared a bowl of foamy white tea. And at this point, you can wait to see along the edge of the foam if it is actually liberating itself from that edge and turning into sort of a squishy pool in the center. And that will tell you, did you whisk it enough? Did you grind it enough? Is the tea old or is it new? All of these things come into play as you begin to analyze that. This is when you talk about what was going on in the mǒchá, the tea competitions. This is what they're looking at. They're not only looking at the flavor, the sort of aspect of like fun cha, where they're analyzing the flavor and origin of the tea, but they're also looking specifically at the aesthetic of this foam. And then finally, if you haven't done so already, put it onto one of these little wooden stands, and then you can enjoy your tea. Or if you were like those many, many tea servers back then, find somebody who's, maybe higher up and give them that tea. You don't have to do that now. So that is, in a nutshell, in a bowl of tea, history in a bowl of tea, tea of the Song period. We went at lightning speed. The last time I gave this, it was 3 hours. I think we're coming up on maybe an hour or so. If you want to reach out to me, I've got a tea-specific email now, which is Scott Tea, which is my blog, but it is Scott Tea 888, and for those who know your numerology, 888 is hopefully a very lucky number, at gmail.com. Yeah, let's have some tea. Can we get the house lights? Oh, I like nighttime tea, dark tea of the darkness. And then, no, it's perfect. I may need a lighter at this point, because now I'm going to play with some fire, make some tea. Thank you. the internet video still doing its thing, or is it a big black like void? It's
No,
fine.
you're the
It's
picture.
still going?
Yeah.
Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for joining and staying. Alright. So we're gonna bring this to a close to a boil. We don't want it to actually come to a full boil. The reason being is that when water comes to a full boil, it kind of deoxygenates, if that's a word. You're removing oxygen, and by way of that, you're removing a lot of potential interesting flavor of that tea, or that water would naturally have. And it also helps with the flavor of tea. So I'm gonna do that and turn this off because the slideshow's over. Here we go. And I'm just gonna de-technology this because we're now stepping into the true moment where we can sit and have some tea. So, welcome back, everybody. So, we're going to do a little bit of show and tell, and then we're also going to do a little bit of like tea show and tell. We've seen some tea bowls. The first one I think that I passed around was this purportedly Song period Qingbai tea bowl. It is a tea bowl. The shape of it is a little interesting. If we notice, it's very shallow compared to maybe this tea bowl. It's a little more round than this tea bowl. This is conical. This is pretty hemispherical. The shape of this is more like what we would see during the Tang period. And why might that be? This is my Q&A for you. Why might that be? What's not happening in the Tang period that is happening in the Song? Whiskey. So if you've ever made tea, if you've ever whisked tea, or if you practice things like tea ceremony, you know that come summertime they start using bowls like this. Right? This is like a hirajawan in Japanese, a summertime sort of shallow bowl. And they're beautiful, but they're also maybe more messy if you're not used to whisking, because they can easily whisk liquid out. These were more, at least the shape was produced during a time when you wouldn't be whisking your tea, you'd just be serving your tea. So this works very nicely as that. And if you had a bowl of Tang period tea in this, it would show off the sort of greenish color of that tea, because the glaze itself is kind of a green blue. So, did we all get a chance to see this? Okay. It's also, if you hold it up to the light, it's slightly transparent. I don't know if we can see that from this end, but
It's very nice.
I can see it from that end. So, if you didn't see that, you want to see it. Other teawares. We're going to look at mostly what we call a tianwu, or a sort of jianyao style bowl. These become very popular during the Song period, and they're these sort of conical shaped bowls. And since we asked the question, why don't we really like whisking out of these? These, on the other hand, are definitely meant for being whisked in. There's, as we'll see, a very deep recess in the bottom of these. That's what we call a tea pool in the center here. And that tea pool is where you put your scoops of tea and where you first make that paste of tea. I'm telling you all this because I'm expecting you all to make me a bowl of tea, or make yourself a bowl of tea. I'm not getting involved. And it's also, as Tsai Qian said, it's slightly thicker, certainly thicker than this. We can see through this. It's slightly thicker though at the base, because we want to create a place where heat remains. This tea generally wants to be made in pretty hot water, not again boiling water, but pretty hot water. And we want to preheat these bowls before we make tea in them. The reason being is that, as it was said in the Song period, when you preheat the bowl, it allows for the tea dust to move up off of the bowl. Whether it does that or not, I haven't really tested. We'll find out tonight. Who knows? This again has that sort of interesting oil spot going on, but the interior itself is black, or a very, very dark brown. And this is, again, a style that was made famous during the Song period. It has that sort of, in this case, brass or bronze rim to replicate gold. A lot of times, this is a Japanese reproduction. This is a tenmoku bowl. But a lot of times this gold rim that would have been put on during the Song period was made of a very foil thin layer of gold. So a lot of times these don't remain. So if you do ever get your hands on an antique or an ancient version of one of these bowls, chances are that rim is not the original. Some of them are. If you go to museums, you'll find them. But if they're being used, chances are those will fall off because they're just very, very thin. I don't know if we pass this around. We can take a look at that.
What was the word they used for tea bowl in China? Is it?
The quick and easy one is chawan. There are a lot of other specific names that are used to. I'm blanking on them all. Yeah.
Chawan was.
Chawan's like
Just the.
the umbrella term. Yeah. So I'll come back to that question though. In the next month, I'm going to be talking about tea and meditation, and in this case, Buddhism's sort of effect on teaware. And one of the things that we do see is the sort of use of the diminutive term zi, like child or little thing, as we refer to teaware, specifically tea bowls. We'll talk about it a little bit more next time, but it gets into the point sort of as when you look at objects, wares, or material things of the material world, to give them sort of a personification is somehow wrapped up in how we interact with karma, if you want to call it that. So I'll get into the deep of that next time when we talk about that, and I'll bring back the name that I'm trying to remember, and I can't because it has the suffix. And then finally, I want to eventually pass around some of these little jars. The thing is that they're all full of tea. And the tea in this case is very, very fine powder. And I don't know about you, but I like to look at the bottoms of things, and when things are full of tea powder, it becomes a lot more fun than it needs to be. So before we do all of that, then I'd love to make at least a first bowl of tea, just to show how it's done, and a brave soul can enjoy that bowl of tea. And then after which we have 1, 2, 3 proper bowls of tea. I don't know if I want to challenge somebody with this tonight. And I think we have some other smaller bowls. If anybody, if we all want to make some tea, we can. Tonight we have, let's see, 5 different types of powdered tea. 3 of them I've powdered myself. 2 of them were powdered by other people. 1 is not an actual tea. It's not a camellia sinensis. So if you're sensitive to caffeine and you don't want to be flying around the room at night, I'll recommend that. It's made of mugwort, so it will actually help you go to sleep. It might give you some interesting dreams. And it was actually very popular, I believe. Eisai in his Kisa Yokoji, in his text about the drinking of tea for one's health, he talks about mugwort. I believe it's mugwort. And so it's kind of at the same level for a time as tea. And you'll still find it being used as either a substitute or as its own thing nowadays in tea circles in places like Korea. So the one that I have is from Korea. So, but now that I've been grinding some tea, I want to grind some mugwort, which grows in New York everywhere. So we'll see. So first off, I won't do this the ceremonial way. If you want to see that in Japanese tea ceremony, the use of a bowl like this and the use of a stand like this is really relegated, or maybe not relegated, but reserved for very, very formal occasions. This specific bowl that we're going to use tonight is really reserved for just this time of year. We'll look inside of it right after we clean it, and you'll see why, or we'll discover why together. So what I'm waiting for right now is for the water to come to a close to boil. The proper sound that it's supposed to make has been given the poetic illusion of sounding like wind passing through the pines or blowing through the pines. It's this very soft hiss that you'll hear, sort of like, and it's not really making that right now. It's making more a little metallic sound, but it is really, really full. So I'm going to pour a little bit of water out into this bowl. It should be enough, but I'll also go through the process of properly cleaning said chalmon and teawares. So bear with me as I do that. The first thing that I'll do is bring out this little guy. I've issued tea into this tonight. The tea that we'll be drinking first is a Matcha. It's from that green Matcha that I've been growing. And there's probably enough in here for maybe 5 people in total. We'll see. We also have some very beautiful matcha that was ground just yesterday, so we'll find out. By way of Setsugeka, which is a whole wonderful place. So, any questions before I go into tea crazy time? Okay. I gave you warning. Teachers watching me do this right now, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting bits and pieces of how to do this. These wares, the specific tea caddy in Japan, we'd call a chaide, and it just means tea container, tea caddy, thing you put tea into, literally. They would have originally been apothecary jars, so you'd keep your little medicines, you might put pills into them. There was a picture, the quality of the picture was not very good, but it came from a tomb painting, and it had an individual putting pills into one of these. The pills were made of cinnabar, which I think is poisonous. Yeah, I think it's quite poisonous. There's another picture, which I don't know if I showed tonight, of one of those lohans using something that looks very much like this, and he's scooping out of a jar that looks very much like this. So we knew that jars like this were being used. So I'm going to use this tonight. And normally we will clean that. I'll forego that because it takes about 7 different steps. We'll do the cleaning of the scoop. Right now it's just warming the whisk. If you notice, I have a couple of other whisks hanging out with me. These are all Japanese whisks. They're probably all made in Nara, which is where you have historically the majority of whisks being made in Japan. The connection there being is that Nara was the ancient capital of Japan. Nara was one of the first places where tea touched down. was one of the centers of tea culture way back in the day. Let's remember I put that there.
Why do you think this kind of tea drinking, and preparation survived in Japan and not as strong as in China? 'Cause I grew up, like, drinking the steep tea, and so when I saw this for the first time as an adult, it was really alien to me. We were, Chinese, so.
Yeah. Very good question. I think part of it is that you had close to 100 years, give or take, depending on when you want to start that time period, of a lot of political instability. Every change of a dynasty in China is like crazy, burying scholars in the ground, burning texts, stuff like that. And then you also have, the Mongol invasion, and the subsequent invasions that came before and after that. And then you also have in 1391, the Ming Emperor says, we're not grinding tea anymore. It's too intense. It's you're using too many resources to do it, and it's also kind of becoming a thing that you guys are abusing. It's a way of like dominating certain parts of the economy, and it's also kind of, I think it's a little bit of a play towards let's just simplify things, folks. And the first Ming Emperor is kind of that guy. He didn't grow up as an emperor. He grew up, I believe, as a farmer. So he was probably drinking tea as a loose leaf tea anyways. Most people were, if they were not hanging out in the court, they just couldn't afford it. As I said, you're using maybe about 5, sometimes even 10 times more tea, raw tea leaf, to produce one bowl of tea. It's not cost effective.
The original conspicuous consumption.
It's conspicuous consumption. It's 100% conspicuous consumption. Now, why does it survive in places like Japan and to some extent a little bit in Korea? And it does exist in the Ming. There are people who still hang on to it, and there's even a book that's written about it during this time, and I think he's kind of thumbing his nose, going like, yeah, it's great to grind your own tea and make it, even though we're not really allowed to. So there's that sort of push and pull. But why do you see it maintained in Japan? Part of it is because it becomes this, as it did during the Song period, this sort of means by which people could show off. It became a way that people could cultivate themselves as a sort of cha dao, way of tea. It becomes a way to, simply get that rush of caffeine that you need when you wake up at 4 in the morning and have to meditate for 3 hours. So all of these things kind of continue to maintain it as such. In its physical form, it is probably very, very different than what we're going to have today, and you'll see that when you drink a bowl of what I made versus a bowl of beautiful matcha. They're quite different. But the wares themselves, everything that you see here is Japanese. Everything that you see here is 100% playing towards what were they doing during the Song period. Everything on this table, at least here and here, and there, are Japanese made, and playing to this what they would call karamono aesthetic. It gets tied up into what later is called the sort of I'm gonna forget that. But anyways, it gets tied up into a whole lot of things that happened during the Kamakura and the Muromachi. So, good question. So 3 to 6. Those are pretty generous scoops. So, in some pictures, and we saw some tonight, you'll see people whisk the tea on the dice. Sometimes you'll see them whisk the tea off of the dice. In my school of tea, which is not Chinese, it's a Japanese school of tea, but we take, we lean a lot on old forms that may have had their origins in China. What I'm going to do now is what I'm kind of pulling from that study of Japanese tea ceremony, but also adapting it to what we see in things like the Daguan Chaden, this text by Sòng, last emperor of the northern Song dynasty. So it's going to be kind of a mashup. If we were really going back in time and I was Keanu Reeves and I found that telephone booth, they might look at me funny. But it's fine. So what I'll do first is I'm going to pour water, or I'll try to pour water from that and kind of go quickly around the perimeter of this little pile of tea. I'll try, we'll see.
You could take a teapot and make it into a ewer.
What's that?
You could take a smaller teapot
I
and make it into a ewer.
could. And honestly, this overhang thing that's going on is not what I like the most. That's actually closer to a ewer because it has its little gooseneck spout going on. But we'll see. If I don't get it, that's fine. No, that's good. And that's a lot of water, so normally we want to use a little less, but it's okay. And then with this, we still can achieve a little bit of that pace. You want to use about maybe a half to 2/3 of the water that I use. As you can see, it's kind of already a light swirl. For people at home, I'm sorry, you're not seeing inside of the tea bowl. I promise one of these days we'll get some dual camera action. Iron, yes. Right, so right now I'm not trying to make a froth or a foam. I'm trying to just make a little bit of paste, which again is already kind of too loose, but we will make do. So at this point,
Does grinding the tea also makes it better? Because it smells much stronger.
yeah, you're increasing the surface area that has exposure, and as a result, you're pretty much instantly brewing the tea. So what you're seeing me do now is I'm lightly whisking, and if you were holding this whisk and you were me, you would know that I'm not actually touching the bottom of the tea bowl at this point. I'm not digging down into it. I'm just keeping at the surface and kind of bouncing it back and forth, which is kind of the crude way of saying that. But as you can see already, and I don't know, a few people at home probably can't see that, I'm sorry. There's already a slight light foam arising. It's still very thin. If you are fans of coffee or your espressos, you'll kind of think like, oh, it looks like the crema on a nice espresso. Not an overfull espresso. Increase.
Because this is stronger, do people drink it less compared to tea brewed cold?
That's a good question. I don't know, because I'm the sort of person that'll make a bowl of matcha and then go to bed, so yeah. If you could afford it, you'd probably drink a lot of it. Now, there's a poem during this time period, I believe it was actually written during the Tang, and it's called the Cha, and it refers to 7 cups of tea. I believe it's the same poem. And they talk about by the 7th cup of tea, you're like flying up to, the island of the immortals, and it's like,
Penglai.
yeah, Penglai, yeah. And it's like, Yeah, because these guys are like riding the caffeine train right now. So yeah, I'm probably sure they were drinking this to some version of excess. Now, when you read the medical journals at this time, and the Kisa Yokoji, kind of being a pseudo medical journal, this is the one that was written by Esai. He does talk about the effects of tea on things like the heart, and I don't know if he's talking about drink less versus drink more. When you go into the sort of traditional medicine of tea, they do say that tea is very yin, you know, so you have to be careful. Yeah. So I think I just added the 4th burst of water, and the reason why I'm doing that is I'm trying to modulate the intensity of this, and you'll find out why, because we're trying to kind of play with ratios a little bit, in the hopes that we don't end up with something that's too thick. And when we read something like the Dagwan Children, he talks about, this is Imperial Zong again, talks about the best part of the tea is when you can drink the foam. It's kind of like, you know, those people out there who only drink the foam of the cappuccino. They're like, oh yeah, that's the best part. That's not me. But that's kind of what you're here to enjoy in a sense. It's kind of a waste in many ways. But if you dig deep into why he might also be saying that, I think it comes down to the grinding of the tea. Because as you'll all find out, if you drink the entirety of this tea, that last sip is intense. It's like the Turkish coffee, you know. It settles at the bottom, and when you will look at what happens when you drink that bowl of tea and how maybe it determined what a tea bowl looked like during this time period, you might understand a little bit more as to why sort of form and function go together. So I think that was the 6th. People at home keep counting. But what are we seeing in this bowl of tea? How would we describe it? Foam, milk, frothy, milky.
It's not pure white.
No, it's not pure white.
It's yellow.
This one, because we're using in particular fruity baicha, it is a mix of green and kind of coppery colored leaves. There's a little bit of oxidation going on. And I think when you go into the Sòng period, they're trying to do their very best not to have their tea oxidized. They describe the different grades of tea and the foam color that's produced, and they say ones that are kind of sallow in color are not that great. I don't know if I'm getting a sallow color tea now, but they also say the ones that are more of like a bright light jade green are ideal. So we're not there with this. I've got one in here that might be that though, so we'll see soon. So
Just shift over a little because you
this one, no, it's all right. Oh yeah. So the last bit of water was the one, I'm gonna say that was the last one. We usually do 7 DM, or sort of 7 markings. And by that point, the foam should be very thin. I mean, not thin, but very fine. Pretty thick, and should have what's called a sort of bite on the edge of the bowl, so it stays. Now what I'm going to do next is go around the edge here, bounce, up. What we'll see is that beautiful little mountain in the center of this tea bowl emerge. And if we were doing a doucha, which maybe we can do tonight, we'll play around with this, we'll see how long everybody's little mound, you know, we might be here for a while. We'll see. But does anybody want to have this bowl of tea? Who wants to get super jazzy? Okay. We can share if we're okay with, you know, whatever's going on right now. Otherwise, I can try to distribute it into this little thing, this Korean sip bowl. It will make the foam move. Otherwise, I can make another bowl of tea and we can just enjoy bowls of tea made by Scott. Otherwise, I would love to see everybody make bowls of tea too. It will be messy, but it'll be fun too. So, do we want to flip a tea coin and see who gets to drink this thing? I heard 2 people, that's why.
Go for it.
Do you want to split it, perhaps?
So,
Go for it. I'll wait for the next.
okay.
Scott tea.
You'll make the, yes, there you go. So as I'm doing this, would somebody like to try their hand at making some tea? Maybe some tandem tea perchance? No pressure. No pressure. So as you're drinking this tea, I want to make sure that you don't fall into the pit that I oftentimes do. I get really eager when I drink this tea, and I'll be like, yes. And the last dreg of tea will come to me full force, and it's gritty. It's because I'm using, if you want to see, I'm using the little, essentially herb grinder. This is what they look like back then, so this is just a modern version. I'm using this little thing. And this is my sieve. If I get really crazy, I'll bring out the cheesecloth and I'll press it through some cheesecloth too, but I didn't do that with this one. And I do this with an intermittent bowl about 20, 30 times, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So this, which we're drinking today, took me about 2 hours to do.
It's strong.
It's strong, yeah, it's strong.
It's more dark in tone, I guess.
More savory, maybe.
A little bit more savory, yeah.
I'm not sick, and I don't think. So if anyone wants to gamble.
I want to make a different type of tea, if that's all right, because they're describing wonderful things. If you would like that type of tea, I can make it right now, but eventually, here, I'll make you that type. There's another type of tea that I was making today too. It's using a milieu, and I found if I'm ever going to do this again, I'm going to start using milieu.
It's like strong, but it's not bitter.
It's not too bitter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Definitely has a bit of that medicinal coming out, poking its head.
that's sort of like cool.
Yeah.
Chinese medicine, bitter.
For this kind of tea, is there a specific way to drink it, or not really? You just kind of slurp.
You sip.
Sip.
Yeah, it's a bit of a sipping thing. And again, I think what they were aiming for was how do we get the foam rather than the sort of fullness of the liquid, because as you find as you're drinking,
It's like ground tea leaves.
and it's like ground tea leaves.
It's light.
Especially with white tea, you get a little bit of earthy, but kind of like earthy floral. I think, yeah.
Have you tried like roasted or oxidized tea?
I have actually oolong here that I've ground. It's a Yishan oolong. I'm trying to remember the variety of it. I think it's a Shuijingui, which is I think came around in the Ming, so a little far away from what we're working on, but.
This sort of tea set is mainly for like serving purposes.
In Japanese, we call it a tenmokudai, and it just means the stand for tenmoku.
But
But
it's not used for other kinds of, other shapes of tea bowls,
no,
just this one.
this is what's really fun about it too is that going back to that, you do see in ancient forms the use of this stand for other types of cups, usually for liquors. And they would have this much smaller cup, usually something even smaller than this. What's also fun about this is there may be, at some point, from this, the evolution of what we now know as the gaiwan, and that is where you have a saucer, you have a cup, and then you would have a lid that would sit on top. And the lid would facilitate, in this case, the keeping the warmth.
It's the greatest invention. So you said that this bowl is only used this time of year, is that because of the plum flower?
You go. And this this is a reproduction of those Jijo kiln. The black glaze and paper applique.
Made in Japan.
Made in Japan, yeah. But it looks just like what we found in China.
You still, I think, make them
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
in China.
Yeah, yeah. And there's actually been quite the resurgence of this style of tea. Even the powdered form. There are a lot of farms now that are, finding that people want to learn more about their tea history, and they'll allocate some of their tea to be powdered. It's
The difference in the body,
mhm.
because the Japanese ones are light and
Yeah.
finer.
Yeah,
The Chinese ones are very rough and almost like adobe color.
yeah,
This color.
yeah. Yeah, much more sort of russet brown.
Purple.
They can be purple. They can have splotches of this sort of iridescent blue in the center.
What you're talking about, the
The body of it.
The foot, you see the
Mhm.
body of the ceramic poking out inside of the
that's just like a white stoneware.
This
Yeah,
is-
the Chinese ones have this dark and rough.
So where these are coming from is around, I think, the neighborhood or area of Kiyomizu-dera in Kyoto. So these are all different forms of kiyoyaki, which just means a type of ware that comes from Kyoto. And the reason why they're coming from Kyoto, though, the history behind that is that you had the imperial family living there, and you also had a lot of people taking cues from sort of imperial styles, many of which were informed by ancient China. So,
Are you gonna touch the bottom of the glass still?
not
Or
really.
only the top?
Is that the same kind of tea that this one?
Yeah, yeah. And as you notice, it gets whiter and whiter. It starts off pretty cream colored and then begins to brighten as you add water and whisk. So,
What school of the tea ceremony do you study?
Sohen Ryu Shoden An, which was started in the early 1600s. So,
How long have you been studying?
since 2005 with that school, yeah. So, on and off, but now getting more serious. So, yeah. I used to have a lot of Urasenke influence, which was interesting. It was good. Learned a lot.
Is there a teacher here in New York?
My teacher's in Paris. So it's a French gentleman who's teaching people throughout the world now. He has students all over the world. But he lives part-time in Japan. And he follows the old ways, which is you don't pay for class, but you pay for class. You definitely have to make your way there if you want to learn, which in this case is the cost of a airplane ticket difference. So, which is good, keeps you honest.
How long do the tea plates last? Those discs?
These things, those I don't think they have an expiration date. The Korean ones, they're usually like I have ones that have gone back 15 plus years. Yeah. It's kind of like pu'er in a sense, not like pu'er, but kind of like pu'er, and were I believe originally kind of distributed as a form of rough medicine in Buddhist monasteries in Korea.
Do tea cakes
Do they keep better? Yes. So the packing of a tea cake, whether it's leaf like that, or in this case for Sòng tea, they would be powdered. You're reducing the surface area that's exposed, so you aren't affecting the interior of the cake to things like air, hot smells, moisture, light is a big killer of tea. I love when tea places have their teas in jars. That's a good sign to walk out. Sorry,
The coffee beans in jars is okay. No. It's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, whatever. I used to work in marketing for, I won't name the brand, but I worked in marketing for a food brand, and they're like, yeah, we'll have sacks of coffee in the store, and open barrels of coffee. And I'm like, and you're gonna have to refill those every day, right? Because they'll go bad. They're exposed to air and oxygen and light and weird flavors.
And I said, no, you're just a marketing guy.
Yeah,
Be quiet.
stay in your lane, Scott.
Well, you probably like the street vendor food stalls here, where
Yeah.
they're like, the food on display is not actually for eating,
Yeah.
it's just to look at, right? The tea in the glass jar is not actually for drinking.
I like the glass jar when it's like, here, look at the tea. You get to see it without opening the actual jar. But even that, I work in tea businesses, and we would replace those every day because you don't want a weird colored tea hanging out. What is that doing?
I like the ones, there's one in Grand Central Station where they're just out in big bowls.
Oh, yeah?
All the tea, and then they just take a scoop and, because how long has that been there?
Yeah. This is an aged tea?
They don't empty every one of those every night when they go home.
Does anyone want to do it? Shall we just pour some of this into another bowl?
You
So
guys,
that's insensitive, so I don't have any tonight because I won't be.
You want to divide and conquer?
Yeah, could I try just a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Here, I'll let you do the pouring.
see how
I know we'll ruin the foam.
That's all right.
Thank you. Yeah, I was curious.
If I have it, I won't sleep.
One sip to get the taste.
Not the risk.
I'm so sensitive to it.
The other reason why you want to warm a bowl, and this is just some good, honest, helpful hint or tip, is let's say there's a kiln error, or let's say there's a hairline crack, and if you hit it with too hot of water too quickly, it could break the bowl. So always warm the bowl. They didn't train me in IT school.
They put it in a spouted bowl.
Yeah, they do. They use something like that.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
So I need to clean this, but before we do, and for those who are brave enough to try this, you probably found that towards the end it gets a little gritty. If you look at these bowls, and as you sip from these bowls, take note of the little indentation that runs around the rim, that sort of bevel that happens. You might be able to see it at home too. Some people say, oh yeah, that's because when you hold a tenmoku bowl, you oftentimes pick it up like this, and that's very nice. It fits very nicely. But bowls like this do the same thing, right? This has a flange on it. If you see at home, there's a nice big flange. You can do the same thing. Why I believe that this has this little indentation, and you see this in all tenmoku chalon, this little, If you drink the tea to its very end, you'll have that little congestion of tea dust that builds up. And I believe as you pour the tea out, it stops that. And it kind of hangs out right there. If you've ever panned for gold too, the gold pan kind of does that too. Or the sluice box, it's the California coming out. So, but I just poured it out, and you can see there's still a little bit left there. If we pour out just ever so slightly, it's going to slow down as it gets there. So just to kind of give you a sense there. And for those of you at home, if you didn't get a chance to see inside, this is a beautiful little paper applique. So we'll clean that, and then I want to put this out to anybody who would like to try to whisk tea. We can probably do it 2 people at a time, since we have only 2 whisks plus that whisk if we want to get 3 people going. And then I also want to go through a variety of different types of tea if you want to try. So if you want, I have little cups which are equally kind of cute. And we can whisk the bowl in here, as you had mentioned, use a little spouted bowl. It's not as big, but it will do the job. Otherwise, I'm happy to make individual bowls of tea, or I like the sharing is caring kind of philosophy that we have going on right now. So, so either way, we will drink and slack our thirst. So. The next tea I'd like us to venture into is the green tea that I had mentioned. The type of tea is milieu, and hopefully we'll see quite a difference, a marked difference. I'll make it first in a bowl, and then if we want to do little cups of tea, I'm happy to do the little Korean soup bowl right there. So. Yeah, if we want to share it, yeah. And I have some kicking around here if you'd like to, so whatever's easy. I know I only have 6 cups, so we can supplement with those. The cups that I brought today, one are, this first little set are Korean punchansagi cups. They are friends with the sickle. This is a sort of gray, not really celadon, but trying to riff on celadon. That comes after the Goryeo period, so during the Joseon period. Like in China, when we have the changing of kingdoms, they're often met with a lot of, topsy-turvy and change. And in the case of the movement from the Goryeo to the Joseon period, you have the destruction of many kilns, and as a result, you have the emergence of new styles, many of which are trying very hard to reproduce something that is like this. This is a reproduction of a Goryeo style inlay celadon, but instead they end up producing this sort of humble grayware, which is called punchansagi. This, on the other hand, is a sort of take on guliao, or maybe like a white guanyao, which is a Sòng kiln. It's known for its crackle glaze, this sort of ice crackle or cicada wing crackle that we see here. And the shape itself is very similar to what you'd see either as a wine cup, or if it was bigger, it would be, maybe a tea bowl. Though this flange, again, I question if that was really initially intended for tea. These forms, both in their small size as well as the glazes that you see, were more what you'd find during the Ming period. This would have been originally contemporary to the Ming, which is the 1360s to 1640s. So. And really, especially as you look at the Ming and what they're trying to reproduce, towards the latter part of Ming, a lot of them are beginning to look at things like Tong and Song ceramics and aesthetics. and finding sort of a interesting reprise to that. So, again, how many do we have here? 9.
No more for me, thank you.
I'm not going to push tea on anybody.
I'd like to,
And again, I also have in one of these, in this lovely thing, and we'll bring this out right now. So before we get caffeinated, folks, we'll get stimulated, but in a different way. This is it's a slightly soporific herb that we'll be using. This is mugwort, and it's being held in Japanese. We call this a daikai chaire, and it means big ocean because it's big and it has a nice big opening. This is the form of caddy or container that Eisai was purportedly coming back from China with a collection of tea seeds hidden inside. This is originally would have been either a medicine jar or just like a little jar for stuff. And the glaze here is kind of a take on probably like a junyao, like a black junyao. So you have this big blue splash hanging on the outside. Though it could also be a sort of blackware with a sort of chemical reaction going on there. So we'll play with that now. And the scoop itself that I'm using, this is made, I believe, out of a hinoki or a sui, which is a type of cedar from Japan. It's carved, and I'll show the difference in the way that these are carved. So when we get into Japanese tea ceremony, I talk about how old forms still kind of persist in Japanese tea. What we have here is what you usually see in a more formal tea setting or shin setting, and it has no node. It doesn't have like any separation along the line here. It has a very simple sort of hooked scoop here. And as you get into, let's say, less formal forms, you get the more rustic and slightly more informal use of and display of these sort of bamboo nodes that happen here. This is like the one I use in my kitchen. But it's very nice, but slightly different. And if you look back at the old texts, they talk about a scoop that would have been used to whisk the tea. It may have looked like this. It may have had a broader scoop on the end of it. It may have been slightly longer. They talk about them being flexible. That's why they like them made of gold. That's why they like making them of silver, because they're flexible, like metal is flexible. If you can't afford those, bamboo is kind of like the low end of all of that. So we'll first make this bowl of mugwort. This lovely reproduction. Checking to see if any of the tines have been broken. Also kind of cleaning it since we're using this for tea. Sòng tea. I'm gonna make this in the way that I know how, which is
Would this be more like a more formal way of making matcha, like this?
Was this more mugwort industry to me or?
no. This is direct from Seoul. So, and where they're getting it, I think, is from the south of, maybe from like Jisan or something.
Does it come pre-ground or did you have to?
I did not grind this mugwort. There is a place in town that gets their mugwort from Vermont. I'm very tempted to go and grind up some of that. I source my mugwort from Pennsylvania, where I go and harvest it on like creek beds and stuff like that. And mugwort is a fun thing. You can put the leaves by your pillow, and it will cause vivid, lucid dreams.
I'm gonna get some of this.
Try it out.
I'll drink 2 cups.
This can cause lucid dreams for sure.
Be an
So
interesting night.
yeah, we'll see.
I heard as like as a paste, it's good for wounds.
Oh, like as a poultice, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes.
So I've completely forgot. Are we pouring it into something and then going with the group, or do we wanna? Does somebody wanna have a big bowl of mugwort?
I'll try a little.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, come on, Scott.
Yeah.
That's why I do it over that bowl. So, I don't know if only 6 people want to have this, but
Maybe we can get
Yeah, a couple
some
more.
other.
one more cup. Or if somebody wants to drink a little bit of tea out of the bowl, we can do that too.
Either or.
And if we don't have enough, I'll just make more. So it's 2 more? 2 more? 1 more? I'll make more so we can, yeah. I think 2 more. Yeah.
We have these.
Great. So, I'll pass this around. I always do this motion. It's the kind of like welcome absentee kind of thing. Yeah, and if you'd like to pass them around, I'm also okay with that. So,
Oh,
I passed for
you passed.
Yeah.
Do you want yours?
Sure.
You want
Oh,
one?
yeah, sure.
Okay.
and what's fun about this
Were you
is
passing on it? Or
Yeah,
passing
a
I
on
lot
it?
figured
of
these
people
are
are very
yeah.
sensitive to caffeine. This has a very kind of matcha flavor to it. It's slightly grassier. Kind of has a sort of celery water kick, if that makes it sound fancy or not. But
Salty song.
Yeah.
yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. So
It's a little sweet.
it's a little sweet. Yeah. It's a little sweet.
I like the cup.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you say that because mugwort is a key ingredient in a lot of seasonal mochis. So mugwort, arrowroot, things like that.
Rat mochi and mugwort leaves.
You'll see them in sometimes like oak leaves. I don't know about mugwort, but there are some times of the year that mugwort is like used as a talisman or as a totem in both Chinese and Korean and Japanese cultures. Usually it's kind of a thing to either cleanse or purify or to ward off, I think it's used to ward off like plague demons or something like that. Recently, if you went to Japan a week ago, if you're just coming back now, they were celebrating Setsubun. And Setsubun is this sort of, fight plague kind of thing, and they make a talisman out of holly and a fish head. And it's this kind of weird thing that they hang over the eaves of the house. to say, don't mess with me. I've got a thing made of a fish head and some holly. So, yeah. So, you know, these things that were part of the lexicon of medicinal culture, tea being one of them, still play out today. It's kind of weird. And especially as it comes to tea, it's still very much the way that it's handled, as it still comes down, you still see hints of its former medicinal past. So I'm gonna, since we're all sharing cups of tea, I'm gonna start brewing tea in this little thing. We'll probably do 2 rounds, so like 1/2 kind of thing, because this is drinking thimbles of tea otherwise. So, I would love to make us now a bowl of the what is it? Bilochun that I keep harping on. Bilochun, I'll pass around the leaves of one that I had kicking around. And if I can't find them, oh well. But for those of you who know your Bilochun, it translates into sort of curled springtime snail. And it's these tiny, tiny leaves. They're green and white. The white comes from a downy fuzz that you find naturally occurring on these leaves. It may be what, when we talk about white tea during the Song period, it might be that kind of white tea that they're referring to. I knew it was around here. If I can't find it, oh. But it was the tea that I turned into a powdered mǒchá earlier today, in between a meeting. So this is it right now. It's slightly greener than what we saw previously. It is hanging out right now in what's called in Japanese, a kogo. This is a incense container. So we would put probably neriko, which is a sort of kneaded balled incense made out of paste or pastille of incense. I haven't used this for a kogo in a long, long time, so we're not going to taste the incense. So they used to flavor tea with incense back in the Song. I mentioned that. So had that been the case, maybe we would have that. But sadly, no. But I love to use these as little, like, small group tea setting. Let's have some tea kind of thing. And we'll do it right now with this. So. I'm gonna keep 3 scoops. I still uses 3 scoops too when we're making usucha, which in Japanese is the thin tea. So. This sukpo is pretty small. It's kind of the same size as like a traveling tea bowl. If you were to go outside and make some tea, you usually have a tea bowl about this big. Yeah, we'll see if I'll try not to make a mess, no promises. And I'm making this one as if it were usucha. The next time that I make it, I'll do a full diancha. It's just a little difficult to do this.
Like chocolate.
Yeah, it's got this kind of like bittersweet note. I really want to transfer it to a bigger bowl. And then I'm gonna transfer it to a bigger bowl. I'm sorry. Please. It's also hard because this tea doesn't have the same consistency as professionally ground matcha. So to get the foam, you really kind of have to, be a little forceful.
Are there portable matcha grinders? Small ones?
The smallest one is still like 20 pounds, 40 pounds. So yeah, they're small. But
Do you find you get better foam when you do the gradual adding of water as compared to?
yeah. Maybe we do a test. Maybe this is our
Test.
dough chop. So. In the theme of experimentation, I like that idea, and I'm gonna let that hang out. We can pass this around and just like look at the difference of foam that's being produced with this versus the white tea. Smell the tea, take in the aroma, take in all the various aspects. There are 3 steps to appreciating tea. There's the viewing the tea, looking at the beautiful lustrous color of the tea. There's enjoying the scent of the tea, and then there's the actual imbibing of the tea. When we look at the term for drinking tea, we don't mǒchá or pincha. We taste tea, and when we look at the character of tea, it's comprised of 3 mouths. So the inference here is that we're enjoying it, we're tasting it, consuming it 3 times. So.
It smells like the original still.
It smells like.
It smells like the
Yeah.
original tea.
Yeah.
Which you would expect, but
There's something that I kind of learned by doing this whole process, and again, this is highly modified. I'm not, turning this into a little cake. I'm not, breaking that cake in an iron or stone, grinding pot, nor am I using this tea mill. There are a lot of steps that I'm having to change to make this happen. But what I'm realizing by doing this, at least the grinding part of it and turning it into something that looks like maybe what it would have looked like during the Song period, is just what you're picking up on, the way that it affects the flavor, the way that it affects the color, the amount of sort of eureka moments doing all of this has been crazy. When I first, I was grinding tea for a good month before I figured out, the methodology behind the way that I am kind of going forth with it. And the night that I figured it out was probably about 3 in the morning. I was drinking everything, just sampling it, so I was very much awake. And when, oh yeah. And one of the things is like you're just constantly grinding, realizing like this isn't good, and you're throwing away so much tea. It's like great. Here's all of my white tea now. Here goes all of my green tea. And just for the hope of maybe figuring out how to do it. And it wasn't until I started grinding it down to the point where, as I mentioned earlier, you see the sort of ionization of tea hairs, and they're kind of like following this wooden thing. It's like, why is this doing it? And at that point, you're just like, this is getting to the point where, on a micron level is where it's going to finally be suspending in water, and that's what you're trying to achieve. After I started putting pictures of this sort of thing out on the internet, I started seeing people trying to do it themselves, and then they would like send me messages going like, Scott, you're crazy, this is gross, and I just would have to say, keep grinding. When you think that you have it, keep going, because it's not going to produce, you're grinding and sitting this constantly. Just because I don't have that one bit of technology to maybe do it in one go, which is that big tea mill. So if there's somebody on the internet tonight who would like to, you know, Venmo me some money, so I can get that tea mill going.
Have you compared brewing it this with the same tea, brewing it this way, and like going mǒchá, and then like just brewing some in a cup or something like that?
In terms of like steeping?
Just in terms of brewing it in different ways and comparing the
Yeah,
flavor.
that would actually be a fun like tea evening tasting.
If
The same tea served.
If I could find that bilochun that was once sitting in here, we could do that, and we could sip some bilochun. Do you wanna try that? Yeah. Just so that we can, you know.
I don't know which one she gave you.
Okay, it's a little curly bilochun.
Two.
Do it by
Whichever, the one that I know there's a lot of like Taiwanese bilochun out there, which is not really bilochun. The leaves should be about the size of an eyelash. You know, maybe the length. They're thicker than an eyelash. And so really thick eyelashes. And I'm kind of doing this wrong too. I should actually be whisking as I'm pouring. This pot, I'm gonna blame the tools.
That'd be a little hard.
Well, you want to have something that has a side handle. And this, as much as I like Bonavitas, the balance of that is more grounding. When you have a Sòng period, the center of gravity is the center of the pot, it's higher. So when you're tilting your wrist, the result doesn't really feel like you're kind of losing control of it. And then this thing is
Maybe get carpal tunnel.
yeah. But for those of us who are here in the room and those of us watching at home, that tea is not breaking.
It's
The phone.
You win.
Against yourself.
I
Yeah.
won't be getting against myself.
We had to have timed it, and now we won't know if this one lasts longer or not.
I'm gonna drink it before that. So. Oh, cool. Yeah. Yes, you did actually. So one of the other things that you hear a lot about in Song period tea is the creation of little paintings and images in the phone. Yeah, I'm not gonna do that. I'm sorry.
That wasn't the latte song.
Well, no, but I don't know how to do it either. Is the thing, and I think the technology that I'm using might be slightly different. So,
Might be.
2 different bowls of tea. I'll pour out this one in here, and then we can kind of see how long this one lasts. So. And this is not how we handle Tenmo Google. This is like, so we'll try to distribute this to as many people who want it. So we can see in this already kind of a different color. Flavor-wise, what are we picking up?
It's more bitter or
Yeah.
astringent than
Yeah.
the way if you were brewing.
Bilochun.
Bilochun.
Yeah.
definitely, I mean, the flavor's
Yeah.
a little bit more intense, but
If we want, we can. Do we want to put the bilochun wherever, into like a pot and just brew 1 cup or one shoot? Not wasting
Like
it.
a gaiwan or?
It could be a gaiwan. It could be any vessel. Who here is like riding high on caffeine? Who doesn't want to be riding high on caffeine?
I haven't had a whole lot yet. No, I guess it's, since we're eating the leaves,
We're
drinking
eating
the
the
leaves,
leaves, yeah.
we probably have more than we think.
Creeps up on
Use
us.
the bigger one?
That's perfect. Call this winter gaiwan. So we'll just brew this tea so we can get a comparison. Pass that around just a second. Any more? Distribute it for those who just can't get enough.
Can't say no to tea.
This is
Same.
it's the same one.
Yeah.
If it's, if they brew.
And this is just the one that you prepared second.
Yes, this is round 2. This was the one that was
Which one is that?
Thank you.
properly prepared.
Yeah, it smells so different from
It's just
when
bigger.
it's
Yeah.
not-
Right, yeah, just that
Bit
little bit of
weight, yeah.
moisture.
Yeah.
You know,
Makes
right.
sense that that is gonna change,
Mhm.
yeah.
If you're ever either at a tea house or tea shop and you want to test a tea, even before they brew it, warm up your cup, put a little bit of tea into it, and just kind of let the moisture wake it up.
The second brew doesn't taste as bitter.
Yeah, I think, I feel like it's stronger.
It's
Yeah.
natural. I'd say.
She sources it from, not familiar, but she usually always tries the teas before she
So-
puts them in, like it's always her personal life.
So we're in this with boiling hot water, and I would say to them,
I
yes.
just don't know.
The philosophy is that pretty much any tea can be brewed using boiling water. You just need to know when to stop. So we'll see if I did this right. Let me just flash burn your tea. The heat will affect the flavor, not just in the brewing, but also when you're drinking it. Generally, you want something like this to cool down a little bit. It needs to be a little bit sweeter if you're doing it, otherwise it becomes very floral when you drink it. There is a strategy of drinking tea that's really hot. When I go into the sort of mǒchá version of talking about tea, I will mention this because there's a whole or skill to brewing tea, but also to drinking tea. We'll touch on that.
The tea wash or the tea.
No, there's. I think this is. If we want more, we can keep rebrewing. I think this is.
This is nice.
I will drink this. So if your tea comes to you and it's super, super hot, just slurp the tea, aerate the tea. It'll cool it down before it reaches the back of the throat. So.
It's so sweet smelling.
Yeah.
This is what.
Would
tea that is
The holy
Just
tree
the whole
powder.
Got it.
completely different experience. And even if you, about a month ago, not a month ago, about 6 months ago,
Spring is like season.
there was a gentleman who had come from Shizuoka and came and did a tea grinding of green tea from Shizuoka. And the base tea that you use for matcha in Japan is called tencha. It's this sort of eviscerated tea leaf that they then throw into this mill and grind. We did side-by-side comparison with what we're doing today. And when you make something into a powdered tea form, as we experienced tonight, all the flavors are present and they kind of create a really intense, almost like eating a bar of chocolate or European style hot chocolate feeling, which is, high viscosity, bittersweet. When you brew just the leaves, you get complexity, you get floral quality coming out. I'm curious, to get everybody's thought though, and maybe we'll make a bowl of matcha as the final, let's fly away hooray for tonight. And that is, we'll see what Crazy Scott's experiments have been doing, and then we'll see what happens when you actually take a tea that is grown specifically to be powdered. So
I went to a gallery opening last week, and they had a tea ceremony and very informal.
yeah,
But they did that. It was kettle, and they did,
yeah,
the tencha, brewed
Yeah.
the tencha, cold brewed it,
yeah.
and then also served the matcha, the same cultivar.
Yeah.
And it was very nice.
Yeah, tencha is wonderful.
Yeah.
It's making tea.
So, is everybody okay? This is going to be the last bowl of tea for the night. I know it's, and I'll brew it out of this, and then we will do what we've been doing and pour it into the soil. So the caddy for this tea is a reproduction of a Song period cut lacquer. Caddy tea container. And I'm not going to say let's pass it around because again the fun game is let's see the matcha fly over. But when you get a chance later, maybe as I'm packing it up, because I will remove the tea from it, take a look at it because as they've carved it out, you'll see how it was actually constructed. This particular piece, and this is an old process, what they'll do is they'll take lacquer and they'll layer it on over the piece of ware, but they'll do different colors for every layer. In this case, it's red and black, which are kind of the two primary colors of lacquer. And as they carve through it, it exposes those layers. So you'll see the striations, this sort of striping that occurs. The particular shape that we're seeing here, I've had it been called pommel shape, which is like the pommel of a sword. When I look at it, it looks like maybe some bats are there, which are auspicious beings for their sort of the homonym for an overturned bat is bianfu, which is the turning of luck, and bat is fu, which means luck. We also see here, and maybe we'll show the at home people too. What we see here are, we can pass this around, are what are probably milieu mushrooms, cloud-shaped mushrooms, which you see throughout Buddhist art, Taoist art, shamanistic art throughout Asia and sometimes in the West too. I think the Sami people of the Arctic Circle have mushroom culture as well. Reindeer mushroom, I think is what they call it. So the reindeers eat it, kind of go crazy. So, Why we see them in there though is because they're linked to, and maybe we'll talk about this in another thing, but as we go into the pharmacopoeia of tea and of things around tea, I'm not going to use that because it's I think there's a strong connection between what we see in tea culture and what we see in maybe some other things we ingest and have various responses to neurologically. So you will sometimes see that referenced in teawares, mushroom clouds, or mushroom-shaped cloud is one of them. In Buddhist art, you usually see that as the 9-colored or 5-colored clouds, usually foretelling auspicious things. There's a little bit of bubbly going on, but usually in my school you want it to be clean of any bubble or blemish. So, but then we're doing this, so all that's gone. In some schools we, I think it's a motosenke, they don't actually look for a phone. And it begs the question, were all tea cultures seeking that phone? And I don't know if we have that written down. If we do, I want to know. I'm sure there's like some secret Iemoto writing hidden somewhere where they're like, oh, no, phone.
What books do you recommend if we want to learn more?
Yes. Excellent question. I long ago picked up Victor Mayer's book, The True History of Tea, and I recently acquired it again because I think I gave my original version to somebody and it's not here anymore. That's an excellent book, and it talks about like the 3,000 to 6,000 year old history of tea. So that is excellent. If you want to look at the longue durée of whisked tea, Hoensai, what's his name? Gengensai, or Sen Shositsu the 15th, the former head of the Urasenke school, came out with a book a while back, and I think it's called The Way of Tea, and it talks about tea's origin going all the way back to, when people were eating the leaves, and he talks more of how it became Chanoyu, but it follows the arc of history that we're kind of looking at right now too, which is whisked tea. If you're looking for when tea in Japan broke away from purely whisked tea, I'd recommend Norrin Waddell's book on Baisao. It was an old tea seller in the Edo period. There is a wonderful book on women in tea culture during the Meiji period, and my phone is right there, so I can't look up her name. I'll include it with the notes. I was just talking to her on Facebook. I should remember her name. I'm really bad with names. Excellent book on women and their involvement in shaping Japanese tea culture. There are a number of other books that are specific to Chinese tea history. I think there's one that's called Chinese Religion and Tea. I could be faking that name. I remember that being quite good. I'll find my master list. If you go on my, and not to put a plug in for my blog, but on my blog, you'll find there's an education section, and it's books and videos and thank you all for coming for tea. Thank you for trying my crazy concoctions.
Keep trying.
And keep trying. That's and I was talking to my buddy over the phone today. This is the guy who said, "Oh, you need more slides on your slideshow." 2 hours before I was leaving. And I was telling him the whole process of grinding tea is like you grind and you grind and you grind. What do you get after all of that? You get dust. You get dust. It's you know, as rewarding as it is, it's also this kind of thing that just kind of pushes you to keep doing it. Because not only do you want the dust, in this case, it's not very good. Not only do you want the dust, but you want it to get finer and finer and finer. And there will come a point where it will be to that level. I know people in China who are making it right now, and people in Taiwan who are making it right now, in the style that they would do during the Song period. I would seek them out. If you know how to write in Chinese, you know, go onto the interwebs, you'll find it. It's there. This is Scott's wacky creation, trying very hard to just listen to what was written in these books long ago. There are even people who are taking these things, this is the dokcha, and reproducing tone period tea. Maybe one of these days Scott will really lose it and start doing that. But it is happening. So we're kind of getting into this big return. Again, a lot of it is educated guessing. A lot of it is people who are getting as close as they can to reproducing it. And it's a constantly moving object. I don't think we'll ever actually get to it because we don't have that time machine. But what we do have are written records, and what we do have are people who were very poetic when they described things. And maybe in that poetry we can kind of read what they were actually having. And we kind of have to be creative to figure that out. They were creative. So with that, I send you all into a highly caffeinated evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Start these things at 8 o'clock in the morning.
There we go. So the next time, if you are interested in history and bowl of tea, it's kind of this weird, wacky history series that I put on. The next one we're doing is on meditation, speaking of eight and wine. And we'll talk about the history of tea and its kind of close connection to meditative practices. Not always so close, maybe closer now than it has been in the past. Yeah.
Have you read The Wind and the Pines?
Yes, wonderful book.
Beautiful.
Who is the writer of that? Hiroto?
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent book, and that is focused on tea as a path in Buddhism. So, excellent book.
Japanese.
Japanese.
Or Chinese.
There's a bit of both. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure, and your email again is scott.t888@gmail.
Yes, SCOTTTEA888 at gmail.com.